I wanted to talk about money and the atonement for three main reasons. First, because there's an awful lot of material in the Bible which uses images to do with money to explain what God has done for his people. Second, because Christians often sing songs which use these images. And if we were in person, I'd ask you to give examples. But actually, despite the fact we're forever singing, I'm accepted, I'm forgiven, I'm ransomed, I'm redeemed, I've rarely heard these images explored in sermons. And thirdly, because we live at a moment where the sheer weight of debt makes these images particularly powerful when we are sharing the gospel. My background is as a lawyer. I deal with lots of cases involving money, and so I've had lots of opportunity to think about the effect of debt on people. So that's given me a kind of particular insight and interest into the use of these images in the Bible. So we're looking at three images relating to money: ransom, redemption, and forgiveness. In the Old Testament, in Hebrew, there are three words which cover the range of meaning covered by the words ransom and redemption in English. Ada is associated with the idea of winning a victory. Kippur, with the idea of paying a price or making a sacrifice, particularly the Passover lamb sacrificed on Yom Kippur. And a goel is a kinsman redeemer, one who wins a victory, pays a price, or makes a sacrifice in order to free a relative from captivity. So we've been trying to put those three ideas into a single sentence. Ada focuses on the victory that was won, Kippur on the cost of the victory, and Goel on the identity of the victor. And these ideas are central to many, many passages in the Pentateuch. So we find the idea of redemption as a central theme of Leviticus chapters 25 and 27. And we have various passages in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers talking about a person paying a ransom for their life. Passages like Exodus 30, verse 12, Leviticus 27, 29, and Numbers 35. So as well as that constellation of images associated with ransom and redemption, the theme of forgiveness is constant in the Old Testament, with nearly 60 references. One of the earliest is Joseph's brothers recognizing their treatment of him meant that their lives were in his hands, begging him to forgive your brothers their sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. And so we see sins, offenses, transgressions, iniquity, wickedness, rebellion, fault, and guilt, all being things that people seek forgiveness for in the Old Testament. A recent book, Gary Anderson's Sin and History, published in 2009, looks at how Jewish religion thought about sin throughout the period of the Bible. And what he argues persuasively is that in the earlier parts of the Old Testament, sin is most commonly described as a burden, as something that weighs down or oppresses people. But by the time you get to the later writings in the Old Testament, into documents outside the Bible like the Dead Sea Scrolls or into the New Testament itself, sin is usually being described as a type of debt. So that the background that Jesus's hearers would have had when he was talking about sin was to think of sin as being something like a debt. Jesus talks a lot about money in the New Testament. 11 out of his 39 parables mention money. In some of them, he's warning about the dangers of being obsessed with money. Think about the parable of the rich fool building barns to store his grain. Or think about Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler who couldn't bring himself to sell everything he had and give to the poor. But in other parables, such as the parable of the lost coin or the pearl of great price, Jesus was using situations his audience would find easy to understand in order to make a spiritual point. Nathan Eubank has followed up Gary Anderson's work by looking at Matthew's gospel in a 2013 book called The Wages of Cross-Bearing and the Debt of Sin. It should be no surprise that Matthew, a Jewish tax collector, probably writing his gospel for a primarily Jewish audience, would use images related to money when trying to explain what he had found in Jesus. Perhaps most strikingly of all, Jesus taught his disciples to pray for the forgiveness of their debts in the Lord's Prayer. He taught about human beings' relationship to God and to one another by telling a parable about an unmerciful servant who experienced forgiveness from an unpayable debt, yet failed to forgive someone who owed him a much smaller sum. That's the famous parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew chapter 18. So what I want to do this afternoon is to explore what it means today and what it meant in the time of the Bible to be ransomed from a kidnapper, to be redeemed from slavery, and to be forgiven from indebtedness. And my hope is that as I do that, that will enrich our understanding of what the Bible means when it describes Jesus' death and resurrection in terms of the payment of a ransom, as our redemption from slavery, and as the forgiveness of our debt to God. Now, those three images are metaphors, they are word pictures, and they interlock, they fit together, and they overlap. Metaphors, word pictures are mini stories which help us to see an aspect of what happened on the cross. So we can say that the effect of the death of Christ is like being ransomed from a kidnapper. It's like being forgiven an enormous unpayable debt. It's like being bought back from slavery. But in every respect, what God has done for us in Christ is bigger than any human experience. These word pictures are like little miniature paintings of an event bigger than the biggest sports final, political rally, or war-defining battle. We can see the way these three different images fit together in Hebrews chapter 9. So verse 12 in Hebrews 9 tells us Jesus entered into the holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. Verse 15 tells us, for this reason Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from their sins. And verse 22, that the law of Moses requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So we've got lots and lots of biblical material to work with. Why does thinking about the Bible's ideas in terms of debt make sense and resonate now? The last 30 years have been years in which debt has become a preoccupation for those living with its consequences and for those trying to think about how to create a just and sustainable future for our planet and its people. In the years leading up to the millennium, the Jubilee 2000 campaign focused on the debts of developing nations, whose young citizens were liable to pay for the expenditure of the dictators who'd ruled over their parents and grandparents. But then in 2008 and 9, citizens in the West and their children found themselves obliged to take on the debts of the banks, which their governments had deemed too big to fail. Debt had become the central paradigm of the global economy, even before the coronavirus pandemic began in 2020. But the measures taken to fight the global pandemic of COVID-19 have multiplied the debts of the nations and pushed the poorest further into debt. Unless there is massive debt forgiveness, we've locked in inequality, unemployment, and misery for generations to come. In English, we sometimes describe people as drowning in debt. Debt, like guilt, has become something that can weigh us down and swallow us up. So in the UK, a major ministry churches have been offering in recent years is debt counselling, often in association with the charity Christians Against Poverty. And that weight of debt in our lives and on our consciences has led to an explosion of writing about debt and the way it comes to dominate our lives in all sorts of different academic disciplines. So the English anthropologist David Graeber wrote a book in 2011 called Debt the First 5,000 Years. Italian academic Elettra Stimoli has written books like Debt and Guilt in 2015, looking at how the cult of debt and its indebtedness has become a psychological trauma affecting our age. We no longer find ourselves, she argues, simply being in debt. We have come to be defined in our age as beings in debt. Debt is something we grow up with. The inherited debt we get from being obliged to pay back the spending of previous governments in previous generations, through to student debt and household debt and mortgage debt. We live our lives in debt, many of us. And so the people around us are preoccupied by the feeling that they are in debt. So into that culture at this particular moment, what does the Bible have to say? Well, the first of the three images is about ransom. And a ransom is a sum of money paid to release someone who's been kidnapped or taken hostage. In contemporary society, it's increasingly becoming money which has been paid to hackers who have carried out a cyber attack, locking or stealing data. A few years ago, there was a particularly dramatic example of ransom. Middle-aged British couple Paul and Rachel Chandler set sail from the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean. It was their trip of a lifetime. About 150 kilometers offshore, their small yacht was boarded by armed pirates from Somalia, who held them hostage for more than a year, demanding a ransom of many millions of dollars. What must it have felt like to be the Chandlers, trapped, separated, alone, helpless, hungry, desperate? They spent over a year in captivity, some in solitary confinement, mostly in makeshift desert camps, guarded by young men carrying AK-47 assault rifles who were often high on drugs. How did they cope with the boredom, the constant fear of violence, the threat of death? You want to find out, you can read their book called Hostage: A Year at Gunpoint with Somali Gangsters. At the heart of the experience of being a hostage is the realization that you are helpless, that there is nothing you can do to get out. After their family had raised $440,000 and dropped it in cash from an aeroplane in 2010, the kidnappers demanded even more money. Further 5 months went by before a Somali taxi driver living in the UK, so ashamed by his countrymen's crimes, raised an additional $200,000 from the UK Somali community and personally delivered it to the kidnappers in exchange for the hostages. That's the sort of experience of being someone who has been kidnapped and needs to have a ransom paid to release them. The big idea at the heart of the ransom metaphor is the idea of the power of evil. Picture here is that we are subject to powers that enslave us through coercion and deception, that we are trapped by forces of evil, sin, selfishness, and death, forces beyond our control, beyond our understanding, and sometimes invisible to us. P.T. Forsyth wrote in 1938, "We have to deal with a world in a bondage which it cannot break." But you can't be rescued unless you admit that you are trapped. You can't be rescued unless you are prepared to call out for help. And so the challenge the cross presents is to look long and hard at our lives and to see where we are held hostage by our own self-centeredness and our complicity in world systems which oppress both us and others. In Matthew 20, verse 28, talking about himself, Jesus declares the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And Jesus wasn't using the term ransom merely as a figure of speech. The term he used, lutron, is the Greek term used to describe the amount of money paid to free a slave, to redeem a pledge, to rescue a prisoner of war. Now, that idea of ransom and how the cross works as a ransom is illustrated beautifully in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Edmund, seduced by the White Witch's promises of pleasure and power, does not know what he is letting himself in for. The White Witch tempts him with Turkish delight, and once he's become addicted, she treats him as her slave. But in order to free Edmund, Aslan, the great lion who is the true ruler of Narnia, agrees to a hostage exchange. The true king surrenders himself to the usurper to release the traitor. Now, that ransom metaphor tells us that salvation is wholly different from drawing up a balance sheet at the end of a person's life. The idea that we need to be rescued from powers beyond our control is completely incompatible with any suggestion that our eternal destiny is a matter of setting off our good and our bad deeds against one another. So if that's the picture of ransom, what about the picture of redemption? Well, for many years, I lived in a neighborhood in London where there were pawnbrokers. These are people offering emergency loans to the poor, and they lend against security. So the borrower has to hand over something to the pawnbroker in order to get the loan. Watches, jewelry, coats, blankets, tools, all may be accepted by a pawnbroker as security. What a pawnbroker is looking for is something that is easy to store and easy to sell. If the loan is repaid, the pawned object is redeemed, released by the pawnbroker and returned to its rightful owner. If the loan is not repaid, it is forfeited to the pawnbroker. But what do you do if you don't have anything you can offer up as security? This was a real problem in biblical times. The law of Moses contains passages such as Leviticus 25, which make uncomfortable reading, but which reflect the economic reality of the times. Someone driven by famine or other disaster could find themselves having to sell themselves into slavery to avoid starvation. This type of debt slavery, known as debt bondage or bonded slavery or modern slavery, persists across the world today, blighting the lives of millions of men, women, and children. Tearfund's very conservative estimate was that there may be more than 50 million people held in bonded slavery today. According to Human Rights Watch, in India alone, there may be as many as 15 million children in bonded slavery, which suggests that the true number of people affected by this in our world today is much, much higher. The problem with debt slavery is because you're in debt to the creditor, you have to work for the creditor. And the creditor gets to set the level of your wages. And you have to pay the loan back in full, in a single sum. Installments are not acceptable. So what you find is you find people working for years and years and years, simply servicing the interest on the loan, never able to repay the loan in full. The Exodus story in the Old Testament is literally a story about redemption from slavery. Joseph's famine relief measures had led to a situation in which many people had sold themselves into debt slavery. They had become bonded laborers for Pharaoh. And the Israelites are bought out of their debt slavery by God. At the heart of the Exodus story is the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. In the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7 describes Jesus as the Passover lamb whose blood redeems God's people. In 1 Peter 1, 18 and 19, it's emphasized that the price of our salvation was not paid with perishable things such as silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. Redemption reminds us that rescuing us from our slavery to sin cost Jesus his life. The cost of overcoming the power of evil, selfishness, sin, and death was the death of the Son of God. In the letter to the Galatians, Paul describes the penalty of death as the curse of the law. He talks about this in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. The Greek for marketplace is agora. And in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, the verb used to describe Christ's action in redeeming us is ex agorazo. Christ went into the slave market and bought us. He's bought us back. He's bought us out of our indebtedness. Fleming Rutledge is uncompromising on this point. In the death of Jesus, we see God himself suffering the consequences of sin. That is the price. When Christian teaching falls short of this proclamation, the work of Christ is diminished to vanishing point. But in carrying out his work of our redemption, Jesus acts as our Goel, as our kinsman redeemer. One of my favorite countries in Europe is Albania. And in the mountains of Albania, there are villagers who have lived for centuries under customary law. If someone is killed, their nearest male relative has an obligation to avenge them. They are a kinsman avenger. Now, in the Old Testament, the nearest male relative is not only a kinsman avenger, they also have an obligation to buy back any family property sold by someone who's impoverished, and even to ensure that there were children to continue the name of any head of the family who died childless. And the responsibilities of a kinsman redeemer shape the plot in the book of Ruth. The Old Testament pictures God as Israel's kinsman redeemer. Leviticus chapter 25 contains a series of detailed provisions by which the property and persons who've sold themselves into debt slavery can be redeemed. And verse 48 kind of gives us the checklist of who should do it. He should be rescued by his brother, or if not by his brother, by his uncle, or if not by his uncle, by his uncle's son, or if not by his uncle's son, by any one of the blood relatives from his family. What if there is no family member who is able to or willing to redeem? God's answer in verses 54 and 55 is this: even if someone is not redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. For the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. God is Israel's true owner, the one to whom we truly belong. God is Israel's king, rescuing his people. God is Israel's father, who will pay off the debts of his profligate son. God is Israel's faithful husband, who will rescue his unfaithful wife. All of these images are used in Isaiah and Psalms. Our redemption is about God buying back his inheritance. It's about us coming into our inheritance as God's adopted children. And it's about God calling us to live in ways which avoid falling back into slavery. So that's ransom and redemption. What about forgiveness? Precisely because we are all and each God's creation and children, we are all and each debtors to God, who makes his rain fall on the just and the unjust. We're indebted to God from the moment we're born and for everything we enjoy. But also, We're indebted to God because we're guilty. The German language actually deals with this by using the same word schuld to describe both debt and guilt. Nietzsche, one of Christianity's most informed critics, understood that Christianity taught that human beings have, because of their sin, incurred a debt of such magnitude as only God himself, the creditor, could discharge. So recognizing that we owe everything to God should cause us to be thankful. In the Ten Commandments, the commands concerned with the exclusive worship of God are followed by the command to honor your father and mother. In the ancient Near East and in many places in the world even today, good parenting regularly included making sure it was you rather than your children that went to bed hungry. Good parenting involves nurturing, providing for, making sacrifices for one's children. Those who were brought up by non-abusive parents have much to thank them for. Much more do we have to thank God for. But recognizing that we also owe God because we've disobeyed God, and the wages of our disobedience is death. But that God does not bring that about, but offers his forgiveness, should cause us in turn to be merciful and forgiving. I don't have time to unpack a theology of forgiveness in full, but there are some important things I do want to say. Forgiveness costs the creditor. Tim Keller tells a story about how one of his friends broke a chair which belonged to him. Didn't matter whether the chair had been broken deliberately or accidentally. The fact is, the chair was broken. And if the chair was to be repaid, somebody had to pay for it. Either the friend would have to offer to have the chair repaid, or Tim would have had to pay for it himself. Either way, the chair had to be paid for before it could be repaired. The same is true of any debt. There's a cost to a debt which is forgiven. Cost borne by the person who does the forgiving. Second thing to say is that just as we need to acknowledge that we are captives before we can be ransomed, we need to accept that we are slaves before we can be redeemed. We need to acknowledge we are bankrupt before we can be forgiven. Forgiveness goes beyond justice, but does not bypass justice. As the parable of the prodigal son shows us, coming to our senses, admitting our guilt is the precondition for forgiveness. How does Christ's death affect our forgiveness? Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14 is translated in the New American Standard Bible like this. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having cancelled out the certificate of death consisting of the decrees against us. He has taken it out of the way, having it nailed it to the cross. The word used there for the certificate of death, the chirographon, literally means a handwriting. It's a written record of a debt, written on a wax tablet, a papyrus, or vellum. So long as the creditor has the written record of the debt, the debtor is not discharged. If the creditor produced the chirographon, the certificate of death, to a court, that would be enough to entitle the creditor to seize the debtor and all his possessions to repay the debt. The debtor would not be free of the debt until the written record had been cancelled. Even in English today, when a debt is cancelled, we say it's been written off. Jesus has taken the debt of sin we've accumulated through our rejection of God's love and our defiance of God's laws, and he has obliterated it. Our debts of guilt have been cancelled by the creditor. Nietzsche, of all people, grasped that the cross was God's sacrifice of himself for the guilt of human beings. God paying himself back with himself. God is the only one who can redeem man from what human beings it has become impossible to redeem. The creditor sacrifices himself for the debtor. Ephesians 1 verse 7 declares, in Jesus we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace. The same combination of redemption and forgiveness also appears in Colossians chapter 1. The ideas of having our debts bought back, paid off by Jesus, and written off by God the Father are all part of a picture of the glorious good news that we no longer carry the burden of a debt we have no hope of repaying ourselves. Now, that way of thinking about the cross in terms of ransom and redemption and forgiveness has been criticized sometimes for being transactional, for thinking about our salvation simply as something God does for us, ignoring the fact that our salvation is meant to change us. But actually, we don't just want people to learn a theory about what Jesus has done for us by his death and resurrection. We want people to discover what it feels like to be ransomed, redeemed, and forgiven. Imagine what it's like to be a kidnap victim in need of someone to pay the ransom. Be a debt slave, hoping for someone to pay the price for their redemption, or a hopeless, bankrupt debtor, unable to pay what they owe their creditors. How should we live as people who have been rescued? I want to suggest there are four things. First, because of what God has done for us, we should be thankful. Realizing the extent and nature of our debts to God should inspire us to live lives of thankfulness. We should be constantly thankful for all the good gifts we have from God, both gifts God has given us as our creators and gifts God has given us as our Redeemer. If you know the Toy Story movies and you watch Toy Story 2, you'll know that the squeeze toy aliens, also known as the little green men, show us the way to go. In Toy Story 2, they say to Mr. Potato Head, "You have saved our lives. We are eternally grateful." Much more should we be eternally grateful for what Jesus has done for us. Second, because God has forgiven us, we should forgive our debtors. That follows on immediately after the Lord's Prayer. So in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus teaches us to pray, forgive our debtors, even as we forgive those who owe us. And then he goes on in Matthew 6:14 and 15 and warns us that if we forgive our debtors, we will be forgiven. But if we do not forgive our debtors, we will not. Peter in Matthew chapter 18 asked the obvious question about the extent of our obligation to forgive. If forgiveness costs, how much pain should I absorb? How much cost should I bear? How much forgiveness should I offer? Jesus' answer that we should be prepared to forgive 70 times 7 means we should be continually willing to do so. He then goes on, continuing his answer to Peter's question, to illustrate the size of our debt by telling the parable of the ungrateful servant. The image is simple enough to grasp. There's a man who owes a king an unpayable debt. The size of the debt is astronomical. Not even a win on the Euro Millions lottery would be enough to pay it off. According to the ancient historian Josephus, the debt the unmerciful servant owed the king was 40 times greater than the amount of tax the province of Judea paid to Rome every year. The king graciously forgives the man. The man's next move is to go and find a fellow servant who owes him a far smaller amount of money and to force him to pay up. Such an action so offends the king that the king rescinds his own offer of forgiveness. Thirdly, because God has redeemed us, live freely. Being redeemed means being set free from slavery. As one who's been freed from slavery, we should live freely. We should live in ways which do not lead to others being enslaved, and we should work to free others from slavery. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:14-15, Christ's love compels us because we're convinced that one died for all and therefore all died. And he died for all so that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. Because Jesus has died for us, we shouldn't live for ourselves, but for him. Our eagerness to obey God should be a demonstration of our love for God's Son. In Titus chapter 2, verse 14, Paul says that our God and Saviour Jesus Christ gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good. But we cannot do what is good on our own. The Holy Spirit is given to us as the pledge, the deposit or guarantee, as well as the first fruit of redemption. The Holy Spirit is not only the down payment on our inheritance, he is also the motive power enabling us to remain free. And lastly, because God has ransomed us, we should work to set others free. In 2012, I traveled to Uganda to see firsthand the legal aid work of the Ugandan Christian Lawyers Fraternity. In that country where lawyers are unaffordable for the vast majority of the population, the Ugandan Christian Lawyers Fraternity provides free legal assistance in police stations and prisons. One of the people I met was a man called Ananias. Many years earlier, he'd been a law student. He was arrested by the police one night on his way home. A serious crime had been committed. And because the most likely suspect had political connections, the police were looking for somebody else to blame. Ananias was put into prison on remand, where he remained for several years. Long periods of imprisonment before trial are commonplace, but because the paperwork relating to Ananias' case was lost, officially he did not exist anymore. When a paralegal working for the UCLF met him in prison, they were able to put together a dossier, get his case before a court, and get him released because of the total lack of evidence against him. When I met Ananias, he was working as a paralegal himself for the UCLF, going back into prison stations and police, going back into prisons and police stations, providing legal advice to others in similar situations to the one he had experienced himself. Ananias, who'd been ransomed himself, was now working to set us free. God, who does not stand in need of anything from us, wants us to pay forward our debt to him by acting lovingly, justly, and mercifully towards one another. Irenaeus quotes Proverbs 19:17, which says, "He that gives alms to the poor loans to the Lord." In the same way, in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46, followers of Jesus are to pay forward our debt to him by feeding the hungry, giving the thirsty something to drink, housing the homeless, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, and those in prison. So what I hope to show you is how we've got these three pictures that lock together. Ransom, which focuses on the power of evil. Redemption, which looks at the cost to God. And forgiveness, which exposes the way in which we owe God everything. Ransom, redemption, and forgiveness are realities in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and throughout history. Our world today is saturated with debt. Oppression, bankruptcy, debt slavery, ransoming, and kidnapping still occur on a horrific scale. In such a world, the cross has much to say. And knowing that we've been ransomed, redeemed, and forgiven should inspire us to work to rescue those who are captives, enslaved, and bankrupt, both spiritually and materially.